Hello, everybody, and welcome to Radio Dead Air Tech Q&A. You've got questions, we've got guesses. I'm Nash. I've been doing Radio Dead Air for ages and ages. In addition to that, I'm also an IT professional. With me, as always, my producer, Mike Gearman, works in the field of IT. If you've got tech questions for us, you can send those to requests at radiodeadair.com via the emails, like it says on the screen, or you can put them in the comments on YouTube, and we will do our best to answer them. So, how was your holidays all wrapped up, Mike?
It's okay.
Okay.
I caught up on my sleep and ate too much food.
That's kind of what we do these days. I think Intel's holiday is probably good. Coming back to the office is going to be a little rough this week.
Possibly.
So, if you've been following along, Intel late in December, or early in December, actually, released the Intel ARC B580, their next Intel Battle Mage GPU from the ARC series. It's the first one of the Battle Mage.
And it's a nice, inexpensive video card.
Yeah. For around $250, you get a graphics card that can handle 1440p gaming and below, so 1080p gaming as well. So, finally, we have an entry-level GPU with some oomph to it, and it's got a little bit more RAM than it needs, 12 gigabytes, so that means it's got some future-proofing. Not perfect on every single game, but on most games, looked really good. Everybody was like, fucking
it does okay.
We have a winner. You were the chosen one. And then this week, Internet reviewers Hardware Canucks, followed by Hardware Unboxed, took a closer look and discovered there's a problem. And it's kind of the worst case scenario problem. Let's get it up on the screen here.
And that scenario is, if you have older hardware, it doesn't do as good.
Yeah, the B580 apparently has very high CPU overhead. Now, what does that mean? That means in order to function and get all the speed and all the frames and all that stuff, it requires more of a chunk of the CPU's power than most other video cards do. Now, with a lot of games, that doesn't matter, because the games aren't making much use of the CPU. So a lot of games don't do that. But some games, like the bigger games, like Cyberpunk, like Indiana Jones, like Space Marine 2, they use more CPU. They take up more CPU power. And when the GPU can't get that power that it needs, it goes slower. So your graphics slow down because the CPU... Yeah.
Now, I will say, Hardware Canucks, I think it was Hardware Canucks, let me find it, did say that they looked at it, Hardware Canucks, and they think it's the graphics drivers issue as the primary issue, which, if correct, means there is a fix for this. That driver updates could resolve this.
Potentially.
Part of it's going to depend on... Part of it's going to depend on whether or not Intel wants to put the effort into driver updates.
They're going to want to. Hardware Unboxed said this is potentially unfixable depending on where the issue lies. If it's in the architecture of the chip itself, there's a bigger problem. Hardware Canucks tested it with an i5 9600K, which is about 6 years old. Hardware Unboxed tested it with a Ryzen 2600, 3600 and 5600. And progressively, the more powerful the CPU became, the less the problem occurred, until they tried it with a 9800X3D, which, to put that in perspective, the 9800X3D is like a $450 CPU for a $250 graphics card. But when they did that...
A bit of an imbalance there.
But when they did that, the B580 performed remarkably. It was super. It was just super. It did great. I got all the frame rate, no problems. So why this is an issue is if you're buying a $250 video card, chances are you are not on the latest and greatest systems. You're probably still on AM4, which is still a decent platform if you're moved up as far as the CPUs will allow you to upgrade. You're on 5th gen Ryzen. You probably got that as a fairly cheap upgrade from earlier generations. That's fine, but you need the CPU to be able to keep up with the GPU. And right now, even the 5600, which is it's a very popular choice for budget gaming. Even though it's a little bit older, it's still, fairly powerful little CPU. 6-core, 12-thread. Even then, it's taking a performance hit due to this issue. And it's, in some instances, the 4060, which is the competition in this price range, at the 4060 at $300, is overtaking the B580. And then you have to wonder if people are going to decide if that $50 matters, if this needs to, because, as it stands right now. If it can be fixed, then good news. If not, that could suddenly bite into all these amazing sales that Intel suddenly had and all this good word of mouth, especially considering we are a few weeks out from the B570, which is going to be their slightly less expensive version, the $210. It's going to be cut down a little bit. Processor-wise, it's going to move down to 10 gigs of RAM. Still, for $210, that's sounds like a nice deal. A nice 1080p graphics card.
And and worst case for you, if you go, my significantly better graphics card just died. I don't have a lot of money. Let me get one of these guys, or the 580, until I can get the money together to get something better. They're both decent cards.
Yeah, I mean, so we're going to have to, if even the 7600 was showing some signs of issues compared to the 9800X 3D and obviously there's going to be some difference in frame rate between the two, but it was a significant difference.
It was in one game, it was nearly 155 frames per second on a much more modern processor, down to 75 frames per second.
Big performance hit. That's nearly half the performance.
But what they also will say in there's a number of other games where there was no performance hit, or it was in the 10% range, where 10%
on an older CPU is to be expected. If you're putting this into an older CPU and it's 10% slower than on a modern CPU, that, if we're talking like a 5-6 year old CPU, that would stand to reason.
That's why I'm thinking it's some sort of driver optimization or some settings that were in the game that they thought maybe they turned off, they weren't turned off, or just something weird about the game where it's just not optimized. Like NVIDIA has their game ready drivers. This a similar sort of deal. Hey, here's the optimizations for this game, and Intel didn't do it for this video card processor combo because someone there may have said, well, how many people still have that?
If someone said that in Intel's low-end graphics card project, they shouldn't be working there. That's a very stupid thing to say.
Well, they did just get rid of their CEO, so maybe that's clearing up.
Yeah. So we'll have to see how this shakes out. We've got the Radeon, and this is just as a side note. Supposedly, we have a name for the next Radeon graphics card. Now, up until now, the product lines had been, for the low end, it had been the X600. You had the 5600, 6600, 7600. The mid-range, you had the X700, like the 5700, 6700, and so on. High end was X800. Top end was X900. AMD, their marketing people are being twats again, I guess the best way of saying it. They've changed the naming scheme. Now they're planning on calling, apparently, we'll see, this is the rumor, the next Radeon card coming out from AMD is going to be the RX 9070 XT.
This feels like they're naming it specifically so it might get confused with NVIDIA cards, which could backfire on them because there is a thing called brand confusion which has caused lawsuits in the past.
Yeah,
I wouldn't recommend this.
AMD had already done this crap with Intel. They've been having this back and forth with the naming of their chipset drivers. The ones for their motherboards. They had already been doing this with Intel to screw with them. They've been naming things in such a way as to, seemingly like they were slightly more advanced than Intel. Now AMD looks like they're doing it to seem like they're slightly more advanced than NVIDIA, because NVIDIA is presumably going to have the 5070 coming. So AMD says, well, we have the 9070. It's going to go over like a lead fucking balloon. I'm like, AMD, could you maybe stop trying to be cute and instead get some competitive prices on your shit, please? That would be nice. Because I don't know if you noticed, but Intel is trying to eat your lunch. And they may do a very good job of it if you don't get your shit together. More Intel. Speaking of Intel's got some stuff to fix. This might prove a little bit hopeful, but I'm not sure how much we're going to see come out of it. Recently, a little while late last year, we had Intel's next architecture, next big jump for their CPUs, the Core Ultra series, the Core Ultra 200s. And it represented a radical redesign of how Intel did their Core series. They went from a monolithic die to tile-based, which is chiplet, their version of
similar
chiplets.
To the chiplets, yeah. And it had issues.
Yeah. On the one hand, it managed to bring down the overall power consumption, and
which is good.
It maintained speeds fairly close to their previous generation. However, in some instances, their previous generation was slightly faster, the 13th and 14th gen.
And that's before we get to the power profile issues, which caused, degradation of processors, in some cases, extreme degradation of processors.
They also, now you can get away with, AMD managed to get away with having slightly slower processors by pricing them accordingly. When the Ryzen's first generation came out, the Ryzen 1000 series, they priced those accordingly in comparison with Intel. They were saying, look, we know these aren't as fast, but they work, so we're going to give you a deal.
Yeah. And what they said was, it's the first generation of a new product. We're going to keep this socket around for a while. So when we get these things faster and faster, at least for a couple generations, you're going to still be able to use your motherboard. And a lot of people are like, whoa, Intel doesn't keep things around for more than a couple generations normally.
Yeah. And Intel, with their new complete architecture that's not quite up to snuff, have decided to price it ridiculously and make no guarantees about the socket whatsoever.
Yep.
So
and put out now a BIOS update to try to fix the performance issues.
Instead of changing their prices accordingly to fit where their performance actually lies, they're trying to come up with microcode fixes to maybe juice the 200S series to be a little bit faster. They're seeing maybe if it was going to be the first half of this month, but they're offering what they say, quote, another modest performance improvement in the single-digit range. So, yeah, they're saying performance between 2 and 14.
Up to 9%. Well, 2 to 14% was the other stuff, the options that weren't consistently turned on or enabled properly. And now they're saying that we might get up to another, they say single digit, which basically you can read around 6 to 8%, because if it was close to 10, some people might say, hey, 8 is close to 10. If it was at 9, they'd say just under 10. Because that sounds better than single digit.
Single digit, because that's still going to be less than their own 14th generation, and that's still going to be slower than AMD's 9000 series, which already was fairly lackluster. The 9800X3D has been the shining star of the 9000 series, and that is unquestionably the fastest gaming GPU on the planet, as well as they maintain the crown for fastest. Well, they're pretty good on productivity. The 200S and the 14th gen is trading blows, but AMD's winning fairly well right now, especially on price. Price is where AMD is really shining at the moment compared to Intel's price performance. It's going to, like with Ryzen, it took Ryzen to maybe their third generation, the 3000. I don't know if technically it was the third generation of Zen, but took to the Ryzen 3000 CPUs to get things on track to where they were actually competitive with Intel. It's going to take Intel.
And then they started to blow them away.
Yeah. It's going to take Intel a while to figure out how to get this new architecture competitive again. But like, I mean, Intel is like a.
And I would say in years past, they would have the time to do that because Intel had the deep pockets to just say, hey, we could do this. But Intel is.
They're in a pickle right now. That's true. Minsby, was there an 8000 series of AMD? Those were actually APUs. Those weren't the same as the regular Ryzen. They weren't chiplets. They were monolithic die with built-in GPU. They're workable, but they're inferior. They have less.
There's a reason when you go to motherboard specs, it will say things like, for example, for PCIe, it'll say PCIe 5. Enabled on the 7000 and 9000 series AMD CPUs. And then I'll say, but for the 8000 series, you only get PCIe 4.
Yeah, they're kind of inferior. I mean, you can get like the cheapest 8000 series AMD CPU for like about $135, but it's a tray CPU and you kind of have to order it special and you don't get a cooler with it. And it kind of offsets any benefit you'd have so they're kind of not worth it. Regardless, Intel's their GPU division is really on top of it. They've been really responsive to reviewers. They've been open about their development process and explaining the drivers and what they're doing with it. When people come to them with criticisms, they take it well and they make improvements. Their CPU division, just the arrogance, they will not lower prices no matter what. They don't feel they're Intel. Intel doesn't lower prices.
Part of me thinks that it's because they don't have the deep pockets right now. They can't afford to lower prices. Let's say claw back that $200 million over, times 3 or whatever it was from their former CEO, then, but
if you're not able to sell your product at a certain price, you're not getting any money.
Agreed.
Like you're going to have to drop your prices because everybody's buying AMD. I mean, you're selling to like system builders and whatnot, but even then the performance difference is considerable to the point where they've lost significant share in the server market to stuff like this. AMD has even there when AMD may not be able to keep up with the Intel server side chips, the cost difference alone means people are running the numbers and going, well, we would need this many extra server units if we went with AMD, but we could get that many extra server units and still save money. Except AMD is in a lot of ways faster than Intel server offerings right now. No. Intel server offerings, AMD's EPYC stuff, Zen 5, not so great for desktop, pretty dang good for servers. Well, lastly,
I was also going to say the server renewal cycle, how often people are buying servers is a lot longer.
Yeah.
So,
lastly this week, a little bit of good news for folks who like, interchangeable stuff and hate proprietary garbage. Europe has finally put into effect the USB-C charger mandate. At long last, every phone is going to be required to have a USB-C charging port. Lightning, go bye-bye. And that means Apple and their dongle adapter is not acceptable. It has to be USB-C.
Now, with Apple, they made the change for the Europe build. I don't know if it's in the America build yet. I have to look at the phones we're getting in for work. I don't think we're on 15s. So we're still on Lightning there. But they were still selling Lightning capable phones in the EU until the last minute, because they said, no, we're not being fined for selling them yet. So we're going to sell them.
There's clear out as much of their old stock as they could before they're required otherwise.
Now, and the reason this is a good thing is because if you're a person who does any sort of computing on a regular basis at all, you've got spare cables and whatever kicking around.
Right.
When I cleaned off most of this desk a couple weeks ago, I found lots and lots of spare cables. Like, I don't even need this model anymore. And it went in a bin and it went to the recycling center. But that's the point, is by making everyone on the same standard, one, the phone companies don't have to give you a cable with the phone anymore. They just assume you have one. Mm-hmm. And if you don't, you can buy a really cheap one and you're good to go. So you're saving money on replacement cabling. They're estimating $250 million, euros rather, in savings for the consumers every year, and a massive reduction in electronic waste to the tune of 11,000 tons per year.
Yeah.
And it's hard for me to wrap my head around, because they say this move of making the cabling standardized is 11,000 tons per year. I can't picture how big a container that is of just non-standard phone cabling.
And that's all Apple. That has been all, because every Android phone, just about every Android phone in the world, has moved to USB-C long ago. It was Apple that was stubbornly holding on to the Lightning port because it was proprietary, and it meant they could force their everyone who made accessories for their devices to pay them a licensing fee to use that. That was the entire reason for it, even though it was wasteful.
I guarantee you what they're going to do now, what Apple's going to do now, since they've been forced to switch over to USB-C, instead of having a Lightning to USB adapter, they're going to want to sell you, if you need it, if you want to pay for it, they'll sell you a USB to Lightning adapter.
Yeah. This also is going to apply, it applied to phones last month. And by April, this is also going to apply to tablets, digital cameras, headphones, portable speakers, e-readers, keyboard, mice. Pretty much everything that needs to be charged is going to have to move to one of these type devices, a USB-C standard.
Now, the only disadvantage to this, and I think we're a few years out, and so they can certainly address this.
Yeah,
is sooner or later, someone will come up with a new version of USB.
Eventually, yeah.
A new format. And it'll go, hey, USB-C version 3 could use the same plug. That was fine. Or whatever version we're on now, plus 2.
We're on 4.
We're on 4. Okay, so we're on 4. So USB-C version 6, a few years from now, can use the same plug. But then we're going to have to go to USB E, because I think D is taken.
Yeah.
And the EU will have to that point go, okay, here's the cutoff point. Everything's got to be on this one by then.
Yeah. But, if that's like about a decade or so from now, that'll be fine. But I love the fact that the EU is doing this, hopefully will trickle down to the rest of the world, because it's simply more efficient to make something that works in all markets with no issues. Like for example, just even I've got a Fender charger. This is for my guitar. This is not charger. This is a tuner for my guitar. It's rechargeable. It's a fairly new device, like within the last couple years too. It's USB micro. So it's still USB, but it's still, I mean, and it's not much of a bigger connector than USB-C, but no. I would love to, the fact that they're trying to move everything to that unified connector really needs to happen. It's just, it's so irritating. I know we're going to have leftovers. I know we're going to have vestiges. That's fine. Just as long as going forward, one cord to charge them all. And, you know, that's all we really need. Just one cord to charge them all. All right. That's going to do it for the news this week. Now it's time to get to your questions. If you would like to send us any of your tech questions, you can send those to requests@radiodeadair.com. Don't have a lot this week, but we do have the two we do have. Oh, one of these is, we got some, all right. There's some depth in these we're going to have to go into. All right. First one is from Percy. He writes in, "Hey, Nash and Mike." You Crit Roll fan? Anyway, so I've got a couple old consoles sitting out in the storage building, and I've had them for ages, NES and N64. My question is, when do I know if I need to replace the old capacitors? This is a good way to test them, and once I do, how do I find the replacements I need? Thanks for the show, Percy. All right, let's start off here and explain what he's talking about. There is a component in electronics we haven't really been able to escape. We tried to work around it. There are a couple of workarounds for it, but generally it's still in use, and it's kind of it's a technology with a major drawback, and that is the electrolytic capacitor. Capacitors are components that can hold a charge a little bit. They're a precursor to batteries, in fact, allowing for control of voltage and wattage and stuff through a circuit. There's lots of different needs for them. In some applications, we have to use a variety of capacitor called the electrolytic capacitor. And this is something that's pretty much in every kind of electronic to some extent or another. There is a way around. There's a comparable technology called tantalum capacitors. They have more stability and long lasting, but they are also volatile in terms of they don't last forever. And that's the problem with electrolytic capacitors. They don't last forever. Now, they last for decades, depending on the capacitors you get and how good the quality of them.
Yeah, I would say that depends entirely on quality. Minor sake here. When I was doing circuits lab back for my degree, we had drawers of components. And of course, we never quite had the components we needed. And that's why Radio Shack existed. But in some of these drawers, there were capacitors that, you pull out the drawer that really sticks, and there's a capacitor back there that's been in there for 10 years, not connected anything. And it's like, I don't think that guy is good anymore. I think that's leaking.
Yeah. The problem
because
with
some of them are just bad.
The problem with an electrolytic capacitor is it has an electrolyte in them, like Brondo. The electrolyte is what enables it to, hold a charge. And it's typically some sort of gooish substance in some sort of, stable medium to hold it in place. It's a gooey kind of thing. Mm-hmm. It will, over time, it can do a couple of things. It can dry out, or it can pop its top and spew crap everywhere. And they do that. And that is one of the nasty things that happens when electrolytic capacitors pop their top and spew goo everywhere, it can damage circuit boards and eat through the circuit traces to the point they actually can destroy the device. A lot of this
if you have the device open and you're looking at it when this happens, it can damage you.
Yeah. This happens a lot with a lot of old Apple devices from the 90s. For some reason, Apple had this variety of electrolytic capacitor they used on their motherboards that over time, they fail regularly, and they can take motherboards with them when they go. A lot of people in the retro Apple community have had to try to work around this for that exact reason. So we don't have a good replacement for electrolytics yet. Like I said, we have tantalum capacitors. They're similar. They have their own limitations. So, and the other reason electrolytics still hold on is they're cheap. They're cheap to add to a component, so we use them. But age, they will fail. And this comes up in a lot of retro devices. Like I was just talking about the Apple devices. This comes up in gaming consoles, old Walkmans, CD players, old desktop PC computers. All of them have electrolytic capacitors in them. Some of them hold up remarkably, and you never even notice there's an issue. Some of them don't. And sometimes it's hard to tell. Sometimes they don't fail spectacularly. Sometimes they fail slowly. And you can only tell because you get degradation in the behavior of the device. Like arcade cabinets have electrolytic capacitors. And when they begin to degrade, the screen will start glitches. Yeah, the screen will start to drift, and something you will get like they'll still kind of work like capacitors, but they'll work out of specification until they stop working entirely. So how do you know if you need to replace them? Well, if the device is working fine, should be okay.
Yeah.
Now,
well, I'll say one thing you can tell about certain capacitor types is when they start to go, some of them start to swell. So the first thing I would do is a visual inspection. You go, do any of these look swollen? Do any of these look like they've leaked anything?
Yeah, let me give you an example of what a swollen capacitor looks like. We can give you an image here, just to give an idea.
And as Butterball says in the chat, the goo is corrosive. Well, the goo can be corrosive. It depends on what they use as an electrolyte. It is possible to use solid electrolytes, which aren't going to leak, but don't have the capacitance range.
Yeah, the solid electrolytes. I mean, the reason we keep building with them is because we still need them. Can you give me the image? There we go. Just give me the image so I can put it up on screen and show everybody. Thank you very much. Very, very simple. Not tricky shit here. Okay, so this is an example, a couple of examples of electrolytic capacitors. They don't all look like this, but most of them do. They look like little cans with these little thingies on the top, these little split ends. And the reason why there are these little splits on the top is so they can bulge. So they have room to vent. So they don't blow the fuck up like a little bomb.
Think about that can of soup that's been in your cupboard for the last 2 decades and how it had to be handled with tongs before you took it to the garbage. That's this.
Yeah, they put a vent in the top of electrolytic capacitors so they have room to expand, so they don't just go bang. They can go bang even with room to expand, but this is to try to prevent that. It gives them a vent, and you can see at the top of that one on the left, that little bit of like looks like a scab or something, a little gross stuff there.
That's leakage.
That's when the electrolyte leaks. If it's flat on the top, typically, and this is not 100%, typically it's a good capacitor. If it's bulging, it's got to go. It's a bad capacitor. Even if it's still functioning right now, it's on its way out. Now, some people like to take a shotgun approach to it, and if a capacitor is past a certain age, they replace them. Considering the NES is hitting 40 years old now, it's close to 40. It's when did it come out? 85? When did the NES come out?
Sounds right.
Or the Famicom? I know that. What's NES? NES release date. Yeah, is that? It was 80. Oh, Japan at 83. Yeah, 85. October 85 in the United States. So the oldest Nintendo Entertainment Systems are hitting 40 years old this year. And typically the conservative age range for an electrolytic capacitor is 20 years. After 20 years, it's a good idea to move toward replacing them, just as a precaution. Let's see, what was the rest of the question here?
Is there a good way to test them? And once I do, how do I find the replacements I need? Well, replacements is the easy part. You can find replacements online.
Yeah, what you're going to have to do is, if you look at the image over here, written on the side of the capacitors are two ratings you need to know. There is a rating that's in UF. That's the farads, ultrafarads. I used to know what that meant in electrical terms, and I'm feeling very bad. I'm a bad engineer. I can't remember exactly what that stands for.
It stands for microfarads.
Microfarads.
Okay, so let me talk about capacitors real quick.
Yeah.
Microfarads sounds like it's really small, and it is. If you ever come across a capacitor that is rated in millifarads or higher, handle with extreme care. Those can kill you, especially if it's rated in farads. I know someone who worked with capacitors rated in farads. Very dangerous, potentially.
You don't need to know what it means. All you need to know is you have to match those ratings. The one that's in the microfarad rating, you have to match exactly. Well, within a certain range. You can probably match it exactly. If it's a little above or a little below, and when I say a little, maybe 5 to 10%, you should be safe. But with modern electronics, it's the older electronics, they had a broader range of ratings, and it's hard to match those exactly now. Like, I'm talking like stuff from the 50s and 60s, 1950s to 60s. So you kind of have to make do with, like, back then they had common ratings like 20, and it's harder to find 20. You're a better chance of finding 22. It's close enough.
Another thing to note here is with game systems like this, there probably is someone online who has listed out the motherboard where every capacitor is, what its rating is. So if you can't read it for whatever reason, there's someone who's already written that up. And they may even have a link on their website where they wrote it up saying, this is where you get the entire set. Yeah. Just tell them you need the Nintendo set. They'll box it up for you. I don't know that for certain, but I suspect that's quite likely.
So you need to match up the microfarads and the voltage. The voltage, you can get a higher voltage, but never get a lower voltage. Because capacitors, you can put a capacitor in a circuit that, say the circuit is rated for 9 volts. You can put a 20 volt capacitor in that circuit. No problem. If you put a 6 volt capacitor in a 9 volt circuit, it's going to explode. You got to rate, you can put higher voltage in a circuit, but never below what the existing capacitor already is. Where to get them? Well, like Mike said, there may be some retros. I haven't looked into it. There may be some retro sites that have like Nintendo NES capacitor kits.
Well, Butterball in the chat says there are people who sell capacitor kits specifically for consoles.
There you go. Yeah, they have like, you know, they've already prepackaged them. There's a little bit of a premium on it because they've done the work for you, but you might consider that valuable. The harder way of doing it is there are a lot of sites like Mouser and DigiKey that sell individual components. They sell the components very cheaply. The catch is the shipping is a little bit is kind of not like, you know, $300, but it's pricey. So you end up spending, like, depending on what you get, it makes sense to buy a lot from them, because otherwise you're spending like $15 for a couple of like 10-cent capacitors.
I will say I just looked up original NES capacitor kit. Mm-hmm. And there's a site that says, here's the capacitors for the original NES front loader kit. All the capacitors that it uses, $5.
Yeah. That's great. That's good. What you'll also need is, of course, you'll need something to solder with, because you're going to have to desolder the existing ones. There are two ways of cheap ways of doing it. One way is this. This is solder braid. This is a braided copper wire that you hold over the existing solder to wick away and get the old solder off of there. The other one is one I like that tends to work very well. This is a solder sucker. You heat up the existing work, you hold this over it, and then suck, comes right off. I tend to work with a combination of both because sometimes things are stubborn to one method, but not to both. Both can tend to work if you do it right. And yeah, and the last thing to remember, of course, is that they are polarized. They have a polarity. You can tell which is the negative side because, again, that image, it's a great image. If you look on the side of the electrolytic capacitor, there is one stripe on there with those little minus, that's the negative end. That's the motherboard that you're plugging it in, that you're replacing it on, will typically have a positive and negative silk screen onto the PCB that will tell you which direction to put the capacitor in the circuit. Typically, maybe not always. In that case, if you don't see one, look it up. Don't put a capacitor in backwards. Boom.
It can be very bad.
Yes. It can.
Well, remember, we had that story right before the holidays, didn't we, about that Mac, that old version of an Apple computer where they discovered years after one of the capacitors has been in backwards.
Yep.
The entire
time. The entire time. There was also a year or two back when Asus released that motherboard, then the motherboards kept going out and what the hell happened? Well, apparently at the factory, someone put a capacitor on backwards. So, all right. Hopefully that was helpful to you. We got another question here. This one, we'll see what we can do. We kind of touched on this before, but we'll cover it again. Hey guys, I'm waiting until AMD and NVIDIA release their next video cards. Then I'm going to see if prices dip enough to make sense to get a used card. Do you have any recommendations for how to give a used card a once-over and maybe sure it's not a dud? I'm going to get it through eBay, so I'll have some safety to return it, but I want to make sure it's solid and won't give out on me in a month or when I'm pushing it hard or something. Thanks, Thomas J. Okay, well, depends on how deep you want to get into it. First of all, there's always the basic thing you can do if the person who sold it to you hasn't done it, and that is a compressed air cleaning. You're going to want to just get a can of compressed air or an electric air generator. Do not use a vacuum cleaner. Vacuum cleaners generate electricity. If they generate static, that's bad. Use there's a reason we use canned air. It's not just because we're lazy. It's because
it's not just because compressed air is fun.
Yeah, it is.
It is at least 20% because compressed air is fun.
Yeah. You hold it upside down, you spray a little frost on shit. And anyway. Now, when you do this, and this is a precaution for every electronics that has a fan on it when you're cleaning it out, hold the fan stationary, either with your hands or use some painter's tape to keep the blades from spinning, because if the blades spin without electricity prompting them to spin, you can damage the motors. So just hold them steady, still, and blast it out. That's and now I would recommend for a card that's maybe 2 years old or so, 2 or 3 years old, not a super old card. But maybe depending on how the condition of the card's in, you want to do something a little more in depth, in which case you're going to want to have to remove the cooler. This is usually, with most cards, it's a fairly straightforward process. There's a series of screws to pull the cooler off, but each card is different. So it's hard to say for certain how many screws and what location, and it's not like hard and fast rule. You'll probably have to look up a teardown potentially for your card to figure out how to remove the screws. And a little bit, there are so many graphics cards that you'll need a little bit of intuition to help you out there too.
At the same time, you'll also want to look up the thermal pads or whatever that you might be replacing when you do this.
When you take it apart, you're going to have to be very careful, because in addition to thermal paste that goes on the GPU itself, you also have thermal pads. These are for components like RAM and VRMs and other stuff that doesn't need thermal paste, but still needs to get heat off of the card. They use thermal pads to transfer the heat to the cooler. The trouble with thermal pads is they are at different sizes, different thicknesses, and
they're fragile.
Some, depending on if you're not careful when you're pulling, they're kind of like clay in a lot of ways. If you're not careful when you're separating the cooler from the card, you can tear them. Replacing them is tricky because different brands, even like you can have one brand that's like 1.5 millimeter thickness and another brand that's 1.5 millimeter thickness, but they have different compression rates and it's hard to tell. Squishiness. And that squishiness can matter because if it's not squishy enough, it won't go back together the right way. Or if it's too squishy, it might go together wrong. So it's irritating. You want to try to save those pads when you take it apart as much as you can, because otherwise you have to go look at you can buy replacements. It's just a pain in the butt. You'll need some sort of thermal paste. Arctic MX6 is a good one. It's inexpensive and performs well. You'll need some sort of lint-free cloth. I recommend cheap lint-free. For a cheap lint-free cloth, coffee filters work just fine. And some sort of you'll need 90% or better isopropyl alcohol to clean stuff off with. And then you'll have to take it apart, clean stuff off, put on some new thermal paste. Again, there are guides to walk you through this step by step. You may not need to do this. Depending on how old the card is. If the card is it's like 5 years or so, it's time to do it anyway as part of regular maintenance. If it's not that old, if it's newer, you might have some time left on it. The way you can tell if you really need to do it is if when you put it in the system, the temperatures go way up faster than what that device normally, what that given card's normal temperature range. You might need to do replace the thermals and stuff on there. How to test it? And Minsby says, make sure you take the plastic film off the pads. Yes, the thermal pads have plastic film on them. Even manufacturers have forgotten to do this on occasion. Yep. And it's kind of dumb.
When I was putting together this computer, I had the CPU all-in-one cooler, and I put my thermal paste on the CPU, and I put it down, and I said, damn it, and I took it up, and I peeled the little plastic thing off the all-in-one cooler, put some more thermal paste down, and then I screwed it down.
Yeah.
And it could have been real bad if I hadn't caught that.
Yes. Well, to test the card, there are a couple ways that are free. What I recommend is, I never forget the name of this. What the hell is this?
3D Mark?
We'll get to that one, but
Unengine?
what is it? Oh,
see if it'll play The Witcher 3?
Hold on, I'm looking it up. What is it called? Is this the one? Yeah, OCCT is the software. This is stability testing software that can be used. It's free. You can download a copy of it off their. Let me put it over here so you see it. OCCT. It's useful for stress testing, for testing overclocks, and for also just testing to see if a component is working within established baseline. So OCCT, that's not a graphic tester per se. That's just everything's working all right. For testing it under load, the free to use is Furmark's 3D Mark, which includes a little free test called Time Spy that we've been using for years and years that will put a video card through its paces. There's also another one called Unreal Heaven, It's another free demo that will also push the card through its paces. And you leave those
or Witcher 3 will push the card through its paces.
Yeah. You pretty much, you can, there's another one benchmark I like that's called superposition benchmark. It's a free one as well. You leave those to run for a while because you can leave those on a loop and running, and give it maybe an hour or so and see if it crashes. If it doesn't, it's a fair bet you're okay. Now you may come into some esoteric issue later. But it's hard to come up with every single potential situation that you'll run into an error. But generally, you push it through one of those benchmarks for an hour or so. You let it run and burn it in the system and actually work. You'll see what's going to happen with it. And the good news is it's rare for a graphics card to straight up fail. It doesn't happen very often. Usually it takes some external effort to make that happen, especially if someone's worked it too hard. Sometimes it can happen with mining, not often. Of course,
because they tend to underpower those so they can run a whole bunch of them once.
So generally, they're in good shape as long as they've been cared for, unless the owner did something stupid with them, which is what you have the eBay there for, to, make sure you're covered. Even if they won't accept returns, if they sold you a dud, eBay will generally kind of help you out. I can't say all the time because it's a corporation. You can't always trust them because they're not your friends.
Yeah. I mean, and there's times when eBay has absolutely screwed the pooch on things. My favorite was a non-technical one where someone eBay, that was a very expensive violin. The person who got it thought they'd been defrauded, and eBay told them to destroy the violin instead of returning it to the purchaser.
Fucking eBay. Anyway, one last one just came in. This is from Blake. Okay. My laptop's nearing 4 years old. I've been carrying it between rooms in my house without any issue. Recently, when I've carried it, there's been a random chance of a rapid rattling sound on startup. It won't stop unless I put my laptop to sleep, turn it off, and then turn it on. I'm starting to get in the habit of using sleep mode and carrying my laptop around the house, wondering what's causing it, if anything I should worry about. It's not the fan. Turning the internal fan on and off doesn't change the sound. And I have an SSD, so I doubt it's the hard drive. Does it have an optical drive, Blake?
Yeah, optical drive, I would absolutely believe is making a rattling sound.
That can do it.
Because anything can go wrong with those. I mean, there's a reason. Okay, well, the main reason most computers don't come with optical drives these days is because we don't need them. And even when it's available,
if you have if you have an optical drive, does it have a CD port? Do you have a place to put CDs in it? You put in a DVD in the thing. That's how you know. No. All right.
Okay,
then you don't have an optical drive.
Okay. So what else could be rattling on this?
I have to.
What did he say about the fan? What did he say about the fan?
It's not the fan. Turning internal fan on off doesn't change the sound. I have an SSD. That doesn't necessarily mean it's not the fan, because that's the only other moving part. If you have an SSD in a modern laptop, only things that can make noise. You have an old style hard drive, you have an optical drive, and you have the fan. Those are the only moving parts in the system. Nothing else can be doing that. So the only last moving part is the fan.
The fact that it goes away when you turn it off and on again is...
If I turn the laptop sideways, I can sometimes get it to quiet down, but if I turn it back the right way, that's a bearing slip. That's a bearing on the fan is slipping.
Yeah, okay, yes, that I will agree with. That is... Because sometimes when you say, I turned the internal fan off, that doesn't mean the internal fan actually turned off. Just means the computer says, I turned it off.
Or if it's working differently, it's the only thing that's can make that noise left. It's got a moving part that can actually rattle in your system is the fan. And
I would punch your model computer into Google or the web browser or the search engine of your choice, and see if the fan is one of those really easy to use or replace fans, or if it's a really difficult use or replace fan. Some models of laptops, it's basically held in with 2 screws and a cable going somewhere in the computer, and it is literally a 5-minute job to replace.
And some of them, it's
disassemble the entire computer.
Yeah, which is stupid, but without going into too technical detail on how fans work, there's a halo of ball bearings in most fans. Some fans use stuff like magnetic bearings, and they use fluid bearings, but most fans, especially the ones they try to keep the cost down on, for bearings, they has little ball bearings in them, and eventually those ball bearings slip and they start making noises, and that means the fan is on its way out. That's considering you have nothing else in there. SSD, no moving parts. No optical drive, no moving parts. The only thing left with moving parts inside your system is the cooling fan. One of, depending on how many there are in there, one of, if not, it's the cooling fan. There's simply nothing else that could do it. So, electric fidget spinner. Kinda, Butterball. So you're going to have to look up how difficult it is to replace that fan, how comfortable you feel doing it yourself. You may have to...
And of course, how expensive the fan is. I mean, it'll depend. How old did he say this laptop was?
4 years.
Okay, so that should still be in stock somewhere. And it shouldn't be a terribly expensive part.
I found fans from 20 years ago, so,
Yeah. It's just that the older it is, the harder it is to find parts.
Yeah.
And sometimes the newer it is, the harder it is to find parts because ain't nobody stocked them yet.
Yeah.
So if it is a simple 2-screw and a power plug to replace, power that guy off. Get the part in, power it off, pop the old fan out, put the new fan in. This is time to hit that fan enclosure little chamber there with some compressed air as well.
Get the gust out. Yeah.
And you'll be good to go.
Yeah.
If it's one of the more complex ones where it's a complete teardown, that's the time you might want to take it to a shop.
Typically the fans aren't that expensive. If it costs more than $10, I'd be surprised. If it costs more than $20, I'd be really surprised.
I think it would probably have to be a Republic of Gamers branded fan to be more than $20.
It's probably $10 at most, depending on, but yeah. All right, that is going to do it for us for this week. Thank you, everyone, for being here as always. Welcome to us to a new year of Tech Q&A. We'll be back next Saturday, 9 p.m. Eastern. If you got tech questions for Mike and myself, you can send those to requests at radio.air.com. Otherwise, we'll see you next time. Have yourself a good week. Night, everybody.